Yeah, I'm going to start off with an apology. Unfortunately, I've got to catch a flight back to Newcastle, which means I've got to leave here about 8 o'clock, which means I'm going to miss the pizza and the next talk, which I'm quite gutted about, both in equal measure. So as Nick said, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. The first thing is cross-platform mobile development, and the other thing is just something I've been playing around with for the past week or so. I thought it would be good to fill the time between the end of this talk and running with my taxi. So, as the name of this talk suggests, I'm talking about cross-platform mobile development, but the key thing here is the subtitle here, looking beyond the HTML5 hype. What I want to do is give people a presentation which is practical and meaningful and can help them make decisions. That's my main aim. So first up, why cross-platform? It probably seems like a fairly obvious answer to most of you, but it's worth just revisiting that to get a better understanding of the problem. Why cross-platform? It's fairly easy. At the moment, there are a number of different smartphone OSs out there. You've got iPhone, BlackBerry, Android, and some people have Windows Phone as well. And unfortunately, the development environment for each of these is completely different. So on iPhone, you're programming with Objective-C, which is an interesting language. BlackBerry, Android are both Java, but you shouldn't be mistaken into thinking you can share code between them. That's just not going to happen. And Windows Phone is C# and a kind of variant of Silverlight. So, unfortunately, if you want to deliver an app to all these different platforms, you're going to have to write it 4 times over using these different languages. Now, it wouldn't be such a problem if, say, 2 or 3 years into the future, one of these would become the dominant platform. You could just choose that one, or at least place your chips on that one, and go with that. Unfortunately, that seems unlikely to happen. At the moment, Android is having an explosive growth, but there's still considerable growth in iOS and iPhone as well. BlackBerry is probably dead. Windows Phone, Symbian, who knows what's going to come from those. But I think in the next 2 or 3 years' time, you're still going to be wanting to develop, at least for iOS and Android, at a minimum, if you want to reach a large number of people. So the problem's not going away. You can't just ignore it. So what's the solution? Well, it's easy. It's HTML5. That's what all the blog posts, the tech press tell us. This is the solution to all our problems. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. HTML5, in my opinion, has been one of the most overhyped technologies I've ever come across. It's interesting to see that HTML5 isn't just covered by technical bloggers and the technical sites. It leaks into mainstream press to a certain extent. I've seen articles on BBC News and the Guardian tech blog about HTML5 with titles like HTML5 takes the internet by storm. New York Times and Burberry joined the HTML5 brigade. If you read this kind of press, you're under the impression that everyone in the IT industry is moving towards HTML5 and the problems are solved. But then there's the flip side. If you're not one of these people that's a great believer in HTML5, then obviously you're a hater. And there are quite a lot of haters out there as well. Business Insider published a report, Why HTML5 is Still Not Ready for Prime Time. To be honest, I haven't read the report. You have to pay to read it, and I'm sure it's probably a pile of crap, so I wouldn't bother. That's Business Insider for you. Probably the most famous anti-HTML5 comment came from Mark Zuckerberg a little while back. He said the biggest mistake we made as a company was betting too much on HTML5 as opposed to native. And that did a lot of damage for HTML5. There have been a lot of IT decision makers who don't know what HTML5 is, but their feelings towards it have been tainted by this remark. And unfortunately, that was taken very much out of context. The second sentence, I don't know exactly, but his second sentence was that Facebook are bullish about HTML5 in the long run. He was basically saying that it didn't work for them now, but they'll probably come back to it in the future. So that's a bit of a shame. But this one has to be my favourite bit of kind of anti-hype. I don't know if you've ever come across the Gartner hype cycle. It's a fantastic piece of reporting. It basically tells you the evolution of different technologies and where they are on this pretty imaginary curve. So they start at the technology trigger, then they move up to the peak of inflated expectations, sail down into the trough of disillusionment, and up to the slope of enlightenment. And HTML5, if you haven't spotted already, is there. So we're just hitting the peak of inflated expectations. I think that's about the most useful thing I've ever read. Brilliant. I'm going to make all my decisions based on this in the future. So that's the hype and the anti-hype. Personally, I'd ignore all of it. You're not going to be able to make a decent decision by just reading that kind of technology press. So let's start going back to basics a little bit. What is HTML5? I'm probably telling you something you all already know, so I'm going to keep this very, very brief. HTML5 is a collection of different features that have been added to CSS, to the browser, to JavaScript, to HTML, to add extra capabilities. We've got things like canvas and video tags, local storage, web workers, CSS3 that gives you gradients, that sort of thing, and a whole lot more. And I mean a whole lot more. HTML5 is a collection of tens, I think even 100 different specifications. So this is why HTML5 is quite hard to get your head around. To my mind, the most important thing to remember is HTML5 is about making the web ready for application development. Meaning all these features and functions are the kind of things you need to develop apps rather than websites. So why is this important for mobile? That hasn't come out terribly well. That's someone dropping their precious iPhone and watching it smash on the floor. There's an important point behind that. HTML5 is a struggle on the desktop because of old browsers. If you've ever worked in a corporate environment, that's even more of a struggle where people still have IE6 to contend with. On mobile devices, the typical mobile devices, Android, iOS, and even Windows Phone to a certain extent, actually have really quite good browsers embedded within them. If you go onto the sites that let you look up the HTML5 specification and see which browsers support it, you'll find the mobile browsers do really rather well. But also, the end users have a habit of dropping their phone and breaking them, and when iOS 7 comes out, they all queue up to buy the latest iPhone 5S in gold. So the refresh cycles are a lot faster for mobile as well. So you're not going to have quite the same problem as the desktop guys do with IE6. So the mobiles are actually quite a good place to start using HTML5. But unfortunately, this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated, and this is where the technology press tends to make some quite incorrect statements. When you're developing for mobile devices, there are broadly speaking 3 different ways you can do it. The first is obviously native, so that means basically write it 2, 3, 4 times using the native development tools and so on. The next one is HTML5, where you access it via the built-in browser on your mobile device. So, as a result, some of the phone features aren't accessible. So, for example, you can't get access to the person's contacts because that's not something that's been covered by the HTML5 specification yet. It's likely to, in the future, I'm sure they'll start covering that sort of thing. Things like geolocation are already accessible, so it will already use a GPS signal. App-like experiences are possible, and what I mean by this is nothing technical. I mean, just giving your user the impression that they're using an app. That's entirely possible with HTML5. So that's the browser-based approach. The other approach is the hybrid approach. This is where you take the HTML, JavaScript, CSS content that's typically requested, fetched from a web server, and you package it up into whatever binary packaging formats you require for that mobile platform. So a ZAP or an IPA or an APK or whatever else. And that's rendered within a browser control. So again, all these devices have, for the developers, they have a browser control that you can use, which is typically quite feature-rich. This gives you a couple of advantages. Firstly, this means you can distribute it through app stores as well. And the App Store might not be the best way to distribute functionality to an end user, but most people like it. And by that I mean most businesses like it. They want to see their icon in the App Store, so that keeps them happy. Also, by wrapping it, it means that you can put in little shims in place to make use of functionality that you can't normally access via HTML. So, JavaScript typically. So you can make access to contacts, you can use shims and all sorts of things like that. So you actually get a much deeper integration with the phone. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. But again, this is where things start to get complicated. So you've got this understanding of what HTML5 is and how you can use it for either hybrid apps or web-based apps. But that hasn't come out very well, has it? But anyway, if you're developing HTML5 apps, typically you don't write everything yourself from scratch. That's really hard to do. With HTML5, you're still spending quite a bit of time resolving differences between browsers. So typically, you'll lean on a framework, whether it's a small framework like JQuery or a larger framework like SENCHA. And this is where This is where things can start to become really complicated. So in the field of HTML5, there are numerous frameworks that you might want to lean on to develop your application. So here we've got JQuERYMOBILE, we've got PhoneGap, Kendo, SENCHA, GARTNER, JQTouch, and the list goes ever onwards. And if you're developing an HTML5 app, you really need a framework to support you. But an even bigger but, in my mind, is why limit yourself to just HTML5? By just thinking of HTML5, I think you're being a bit blinkered, if that's what you're doing. The problem you're trying to tackle is how to share code to create multiple mobile applications. That's a fundamental problem, and it doesn't have to be solved by HTML5. And here are a few alternative technologies. So we've got Xamarin, we've got Titanium Accelerator, we've got Corona, Adobe Air, Mosaic. All of these are technologies that aren't HTML5 based that will achieve the same end result. So, if you're in a position where you need to develop across multiple platforms and you've decided you want to use cross-platform tooling, you've got a difficult problem ahead of you. One of the first things you're going to want to do is select a framework to support you. You're not going to want to start from just JavaScript and just the browser DOM. So how do you select one of these frameworks? Well, firstly, the usual principles apply. If you're selecting any framework, whether it's client-side, server-side, there are the usual things you consider, things like cost, maturity, support, what's the community like around it, that sort of thing. But for mobile applications, there are certain special things that you really need to consider. The first one is the end user experience. One of the problems that you've probably heard about HTML5 is the compromised user experience. If you're selecting a framework, you really need to test that. Also, the developer experience. Some of these cross-platform frameworks have quite complex, convoluted tooling that will actually get in your way rather than help you achieve your end result. The next one is how much code is shared. If you select a cross-platform framework that doesn't give you much code sharing, it's not a lot of use. And also, which platforms do you care about? Quite a few of them exclude certain platforms, typically BlackBerry or Windows Phone. So that's it. So now you've got to go and start testing. And if you want a head start, I can give you a list of about 30 frameworks to go away and try in your own time. And I've been in this position before, where we've delivered an application to a client and we've had to select a framework and we've sat there scratching our heads thinking, where do we start with this? So what myself and a group of people did was we got together and we decided that we're going to create an open source project that will help people decide which framework to use by re-implementing the same application using all these different technologies. And it's called Property Cross. And if you've ever had to select a JavaScript MVC framework, you might have heard of To Do MVC. If not, you should visit that site. It's a really cool site. What they've done is they've taken the same simple application and re-implemented it in about 30 or 40 different frameworks. So you can basically use it as a side-by-side comparison. So we decided to do exactly the same thing, but for mobile applications. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it and give you a few demos to show you the implication of selecting some frameworks. So the first thing we did was we wanted to select a realistic application. As you can guess by the title, Property Cross, it's a property listings searching application. So it's realistic. It's the kind of thing that you might want to put into the App Store or the Marketplace. It's not trivial. It's multi-screen, it has persistence, it uses GPS, it makes calls to web services, so it's a complicated application. We also made it ready for App Store distribution. So we wanted it to be a packaged application, so a hybrid application. We also wanted to match the native look and feel for each platform. And we made that decision not because I think it's the right decision. We made that decision because that's what most people want to do right now. And I'll get back to that in a minute. And we also wanted to make it well designed and well structured. So we wanted to see how good these frameworks were at supporting a decent structured layered architecture. So if you're interested, you can have a look on the website and you can see a huge list of frameworks here. You can see the Android, iOS and Windows Phone versions. You'll find there's no BlackBerry versions yet, because no one I know actually likes doing BlackBerry. So if you're interested in BlackBerry, by all means, contribute. So yeah, you can download the codes, it's all on GitHub. You can also install the apps. So what I'm going to do is demo some of them. I'm not going to demo all of them. Each one of these blogs is an app. There's about 35 of them. We'll be here all night. So I'm going to demonstrate a few different ones, just to give you a bit of insight into the implications of some of these frameworks. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you the native application. So The recording's not that great, but you can see this is on the iOS platform. So it's a property search. You can type in postcode, that sort of thing. It's supported by an API from a company called Astoria. So here you can see the list of search results. You can tap on a property to view the details. There's a little favourites button in the top corner there, so that will persist the settings. It records recent searches, that sort of thing. So it's a reasonably functional app. We didn't put too much energy and effort into styling it, not because we can't do stylish stuff, but because we didn't think that was a terribly fair comparison. We wanted to look at the out-of-the-box look and feel of these frameworks. So that's the iOS version. Yeah, good time on that. This is the, I'm correcting this one. This is the Android version. So here you can see, important difference, it looks like an Android application. Delivers exactly the same functionality, but yeah, I think we've tidied this one up a bit actually. The guy that did this didn't have terribly good attention to detail, it was a bit wonky. But okay, here's the Windows Phone version, and this one is quite different from the others. It has the Metro look and feel, it's got a sort of flat interface, and when you search for listings, the listings appear as kind of little tiles, that sort of thing. So yeah, you can see this is the kind of application you'd want to give to your end users for that particular platform. So what I'm going to do is show you a few of the different frameworks and show how the implementations compare to the native one. So the first one I'm going to show you is JQueryMobile, for no other reason than this being the most popular cross-platform HTML5 framework. Not because it's the best, it's because it's got the name jQuery next to it. jQuery is used in something like 40% of the websites on the internet. It's tremendously popular. It's actually a really good framework, but jQueryMobile, you know, it may not be the best. One thing that's interesting to note is jQueryMobile is just a UI framework. There's a lot of things it doesn't do that you need within a JavaScript-based application. So we added things like Knockout to give us an MVC or MVVM framework. We use require.js for modular dependencies. We also use jQuery Metro, and this is what it's like when you're doing JavaScript development. Typically, you take bits and pieces from here and there and plug them all together. And jQueryMobile is just one piece of the puzzle. We also use PhoneGap for wrapping. So what PhoneGap does is PhoneGap gives you the wrapper that allows you to run it as if it was a native application and use it and submit it to the App Store or Marketplace. So let's have a look at the jQueryMobile application. So let's have a look. Now, each one of these applications delivers exactly the same end-user functionality. So here you can see it looks quite like an iOS application. It doesn't look the same as a native application, but the style that they've chosen, this is the out-of-the-box style, looks pretty familiar to an iOS user. And functionally, it looks pretty good. You've got the sliding interactions, that sort of thing. There are actually quite a few jQueryMobile applications in the App Store, and I think they're reasonably well received. If you look closely, you will see the occasional UI glitch, but it's pretty acceptable. Next up is the Android application. So again, this is using the same code base, and the first thing to note here is it looks exactly the same as the iOS application. And this is because jQueryMobile does not have any themes that look right on, well, that are tailored for the Android platform. And personally, I'm not an Android user, but if I was, I'd be insulted by this. I don't think Android users want their apps to look like iPhone apps. They want their apps to look like Android apps. I know a few years ago, Android didn't have a terribly strong look and feel, but now it's starting to get its own personality. And personally, I think we need to respect that. This is on Windows Phone, and interestingly, it was Microsoft who contributed to the open source community. They contributed this theme for jQueryMobile. And on the surface of things, it looks okay, but there are all kinds of horrible glitches in there. You get all kinds of jumping around, you get a funny grey shading whenever you click on links, that sort of thing. It doesn't integrate terribly well with the back button. Basically, I would never submit this to the marketplace. I don't think you'd get terribly good ratings as a result. So one thing I want to look at in a little bit more detail is some of the subtleties here. I don't know if you've ever looked at this in detail, but on iOS, pre-iOS 7, I have to say, this is the transition effect that you get as you navigate from one view to the next. It's It's incredibly subtle. It involves about 5 or 6 elements moving at slightly different velocities, slightly different opacity transforms, and it's really quite nice. And that's a built-in effect. You find it in the stock applications, and you also find it in the applications that people have written themselves. It's pretty nice. This is jQuery Mobile. It's not quite so nice, is it? So basically it's sliding the whole thing backwards and forwards, and there's just a tiny little jiggle as it moves into place. And I noticed it. To be honest, I don't think most end users will notice it. I don't think they will be able to describe the difference, but I think they'll feel it. I think they will sense that there is something slightly different in this application. I don't think it will fill them with as much joy as if it did the right transition. And the reason they do this is because to mimic the iOS sort of transition from one frame to another is tremendously hard with HTML5. So that's one interesting point there. So just a few random thoughts and remarks on jQuery Mobile. The first is that there have been some user experience, some UI compromises. The Android thing uses the iOS thing, which in my opinion is really bad. The Windows Phone experience was very poor. I'd say it's so poor you wouldn't want to use it. There was also some friction between the frameworks. This is more of a JavaScript story. jQuery Mobile and Knockout don't play together terribly nicely. And as a developer, the tooling was the standard web approach. So basically using Chrome, using whatever tools, WebStorm, Visual Studio if you must, or whatever tools you're used to. So yeah, if you like that kind of tooling, I think I quite do. I quite like that tooling myself. It's good. This chart here is the code sharing. Here we're looking at the code base, and the stuff in yellow is common. And if you're wondering who this guy is, we couldn't work out what icon to use for common, so the first thing we did was a Google image search, of course. And this guy's face was all over the place. Apparently he's a US rapper called Common. I didn't know, but we decided to use him anyway. I hope it doesn't work. So again, you can see there's a large slice of common code here. There's also quite a big slice of Windows Phone code, and that was to sort of paper over some of the issues there. So again, this is the sort of thing you need to pay attention to.
Was that JavaScript code and fix-ups? And
yes, that's...
Not just Metro UI?
Yes, we basically took a call in terms of counting the stuff which we think matters. So we count HTML, we count JavaScript, we count CSS, and we basically make a call. It's never going to be an exact science. Lines of code count are never an exact science. So the next one I want to talk about is SENCHA. And again, this is a very popular HTML5 framework. It's a commercial framework. I say it's built using XJS. I don't think that's quite true. It's built by the team that brought XJS out, which is an enterprise-scale JavaScript framework. They've got a lot of really talented engineers there. They've got a lot of experience in web development. One big difference between SENCHA and jQuery Mobile is SENCHA is an end-to-end solution. So it gives you everything. It gives you the UI layer, it gives you the mod layer, it gives you the packaging for the App Store, it gives you everything. Also, these guys, if you haven't heard of Fastbook before, I'd really encourage you to go out and have a look at Fastbook. When Facebook made the announcement that they were dumping HTML5, it did a lot of damage to HTML5, and I'm guessing it did a lot of damage financially to this company. And the developers there were really annoyed because they know that a lot of what was wrong with Facebook was the way it was developed, not the technologies that were used. So what they did was they created a proof of concept called Fastbook, which was basically their own re-implementation of Facebook using HTML5. And it's really good, actually. So it's well worth having a look at. So this is SENCHA in action. So this is on the iOS device. So that little quirk is a PhoneGap quirk. I've raised a bug against PhoneGap builds and they've fixed it now. I just need to reshoot the video. But again, that's part of the process of using all these tools. As you can see, it's a really quite neat, fast application. One other interesting thing is when you're doing this kind of scroll on a mobile device with things like SENCHA and jQuery Mobile, it's not native browser scroll, and this is all implemented in JavaScript. It's pretty impressive stuff. So yeah, it's a pretty good look and feel. Out of all the HTML5 apps I've seen, it's certainly the most responsive. And here it is working on Android. And again, a little bit of a pause. I don't know what went wrong there. It's probably garbage collecting or something. So a little bit of a pause, but one thing you'll notice here is it looks exactly the same again. SENCHA as well have kind of insulted the Android users by not bothering to make it look like an Android device Android look and feel. I think SENCHA are actually working on this, and they might have even submitted a pull request, so I should probably update this video. But yeah, they're working on it. No Windows Phone though, although again, SENCHA Touch have brought out a Windows Phone version, but it's not very good. So a few thoughts on SENCHA Touch. It provides a very thick UI abstraction. It's so thick you don't actually write HTML, which I'm a little uneasy about. I quite like HTML and JavaScript, and I like being able to write HTML. It's a good language for creating user interfaces. Whereas with SENCHA Touch, you create user interfaces in a kind of JSON format, so you basically say toolbar goes here, button goes here, that sort of thing. But one advantage of that really thick abstraction layer is they can then pick and choose how they render it with iOS and Android in a way that you couldn't if this was just HTML and CSS. And it has an almost declarative feel to the application code as a result. The user experience is really quite impressive. I can bet any non-developer will not be able to spot that as a HTML5 app. It does have a bit of a steep learning curve though. Again, this is because it takes you away from HTML5. You are basically programming against SENCHA APIs. And no Windows Phone support. But here you can see you've got a 100% shared code base. So that's a couple of the HTML5 frameworks. We've looked at some of the common pitfalls there. What I want to do is talk about some of the non-HTML5 frameworks. And these are the ones that personally I don't feel get enough attention from the press, technology bloggers. These guys get ignored, and some of them have got some really nice solutions. The first one I'm going to choose, again, I'm just going to choose the one that's most popular at the moment, the one that people tend to use, and that's Titanium from a company called Accelerator. It's a commercial framework. A big difference between this and JQuERYMOBILE and SENCHA is that this creates a fully native user interface on both iOS and Android. So the controls people using are native controls. Your code's written in JavaScript, it runs in an interpreter, although I think actually they do some compilation now. I think there's a lot of secrecy about what they actually do, but basically you're writing JavaScript code. You use their own IDE, which is an Eclipse-based IDE, but it relies on native build tools. So in the background, it's doing all kinds of funky things with Xcode for iOS. It also has a very thick abstraction layer that hides Android and iOS differences. So you're basically saying, I need this kind of navigation, and in the iOS world, you might get a tab at the bottom, in the Android world, you might get the equivalent at the top. There's a thick abstraction layer there. So let's have a look at the app actually running. And one of the first things we probably notice here is that it looks exactly the same as the native application. And all the funky transitions, everything is exactly the same. So again, an end user would have no idea that they're using a cross-platform application, which, again, is a great big advantage, especially with the sort of negative press HTML5 has had regarding user experience. So here we have a look at the Android application. And again, it's a fully native look and feel, and again, it feels like a quality application. I'm not that fast at typing. So there you go, property listings, that sort of thing. And again, with a bit more time and attention, you could create the kind of application you'd happily submit to the marketplace using Titanium. It seems like a decent technology. So a few thoughts on this. The first point, and probably the most important, is that native user interface gives you the best user experience. And you're not worrying about the performance of your JavaScript or HTML or CSS. My next point is why JavaScript? I quite enjoy writing JavaScript. It's fun, but if I had a choice between JavaScript and being able to replace it with something else, I'd typically choose something else, something type-safe. So I don't know why they chose JavaScript when they could have used any language under the sun. There's a bit of friction due to the thick stack. And what I mean by this is, in practice, we found certain quirks, glitches, and things that were hard to debug because your code was going through quite a complex compilation process, running through the Titanium IDE, through Xcode, and spitting out the inside. It also has a bit of a leaky abstraction. There are times when you do have to do a kind of if iOS do this, if Android do that. They kind of bury it right at the bottom of the documentation under kind of embarrassing bits. To be fair, the application was developed pretty quickly. It was developed by a guy, Chris, I sit next to him. He developed it in just 2 days without ever having done Titanium before. No Windows Phone support. I don't know if anyone's upset by that. Any Windows phones? So the next one I want to talk about is Xamarin. So this is another technology which creates native applications. So Xamarin is quite different from Titanium. You achieve similar end results but in a very different manner. Xamarin, when you're using Xamarin, you program in C# using the .NET framework. So if you've done WPF, ASP.NET, that sort of thing, it's a familiar environment. The difference is, whilst the Titanium applications have a thick abstraction layer, you kind of say, I want a button here, or I want to have this kind of navigation here. The Xamarin abstraction layer is very thin and it's paper thin. Basically, you get the iOS APIs and the Android APIs magically translated into C#, which is pretty cool. It also delivers, again, a fully native user interface. So we'll have a look at the Xamarin application, although I think you can probably guess what's coming next. The Xamarin application looks exactly the same as the native application. I'm not going to play through all of that. So just some general thoughts and remarks on Xamarin. It's not the same thoughts and remarks as Titanium, even though they have a similar result. The first one is, again, it matches the native user experience exactly, which is very useful. One point is there's more code. The Xamarin code base is bigger than any of the other cross-platform code bases that we've written for Property Cross. And the main reason for that is because it lacks a UI abstraction layer. You have to write iOS-specific code, Android-specific code, Windows Phone-specific code. And this is what happens, this is why we've got a pie chart that looks like this. We've got sort of 40% common code, and then we've got quite a large slice of code specific to each platform, programming against their APIs. One problem with that is you could very easily end up with zero code shared. It's up to you to manage your application, to put in place good design patterns to maximize the code sharing. But a big difference, I think the way I'd summarize the differences between Titanium and Xamarin is because Titanium has a thick abstraction layer, you can do easy things very quickly, but hard things become impossible. Whereas with Xamarin, everything is quite hard because you've got to write a lot of code, but you can do anything you like. So if you want to mimic some of the really fancy new user interfaces, things like Clear for iOS, some of the gesture-driven stuff, you can do all of that in Xamarin, and you wouldn't have a hope of doing that with Titanium. So they're very different frameworks in that respect. So that was just a few of them, and then there's the rest. So if you go on the Property Cross website, all the ones highlighted in yellow are complete and ready for you to play with. The ones in white are the ones that are coming out soon. And these guys that are in grey are ones that people have raised as issues for framework requests. And quite often people ask me what my opinion is of these various frameworks. So I'm going to try and give you my opinion very, very quickly. So you might want to grab a pen and paper. So from the top, Adobe Air is the same Flash Flex runtime but run on mobile. You actually get a pretty decent end user experience. They render the entire UI is rendered by the Adobe Air framework. It's really quite nice, but I wouldn't touch it personally because the name Flash and Flex are all quite tainted, probably for the wrong reasons. It's a pretty good mobile solution, but I think most people just don't want to touch Flash or Flex anymore. Enyo is developed by the WebOS guys, and it's shite. JQ Touch. No, I didn't. Okay. JQ Touch was I think forked from JQUERYMOBILE at some point in history. It's incredibly similar. It's hard to tell the difference, and yeah, there's not much more to say about it. RoMobile is from Motorola. It's horrible. It's one of the worst I've come across. It's a strange bastardization of all kinds of different things, and you have to install about 50 terabytes of IDE to actually do anything. Kendo UI is a bit of a surprise one for me. It comes from a company called Telerik, who are very much a Microsoft controls company, very much a C# and VB.NET company. I think they've realised that Windows is kind of on a downward slope, so they wanted to jump onto the JavaScript bandwagon, and surprisingly they did it really rather well. So the Kendo UI framework for web and mobile, in my opinion, is pretty decent. NGWT is a mobile version of Google Web Toolkit. I use this for client projects actually, it's really quite good. You can write Java code that's compiled to JavaScript and you get full sort of low-level access to the DOM. You can do whatever you like, but with fully type-safe language. So if you're creating a big application, it's quite good. And the mobile tooling is pretty good as well, so I quite like that one. Intel App Framework was a company called AppMobi, which kind of looked a bit fishy. I think they're taking all their open source stuff and commercialised it. It then got bought by Intel. It doesn't look that great. Lungo is a fairly new one. It looks like it's starting to become quite popular. It's quite popular on GitHub. It produces a really clean, modern-looking UI. They've decided not to copy iOS, not to copy Android. They've gone for their own look and feel. And it was kind of forward-thinking because it now looks like the iOS 7 look and feel. Phone.js is from a company called DevExpress, who are another Microsoft company. And again, they've done a surprisingly good job on that. The main difference between Phone.js and Kendo UI is Phone.js has got some fairly deep Visual Studio integration. It's done reasonably well. Lavaca is another open source one. It's just not terribly popular, so it's probably not worth looking at. Embarcadero is hands up if you're a Delphi developer. There's not many Delphi developers about, and Delphi, again, like the Microsoft component vendors, they're trying to remain relevant, and they've come up with some cross-platform tooling, which kind of looks okay, but if you're not a Delphi developer, then there's no point in looking at it. So that's some quick opinions. I hope I consulted anyone. So some conclusions. Personally, I think HTML5 is a viable technology, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But at the same time, HTML5 is the root of compromise. And I don't see that as a bad thing. People think compromise is bad, but compromise, if you understand the compromises you make, and you're saving a lot of money by doing it, it's a really good thing to do. So if you want to develop an app where you know it doesn't have to have a super slick user interface, maybe you're doing it for enterprise customers, or maybe it's just not that exciting an app, HTML5 is a really good idea. But HTML5 is not the only cross-platform technology, and so many people ignore this. There's a lot of great technologies out there that solve some of the key issues with HTML5. So to summarise, choosing a framework. This is the process that I've used in the past and I'd recommend. The first thing is to determine what's important for your application, and don't say anything. Decide which are more important. Is it cost, user experience, which platforms you want to deliver it to? Some of these have got to be more important than others, and some of these will help you make the compromises that you probably need to. Then use property cross to narrow down the selection. So what I mean by that is look for the ones that you think meet your sort of profile for your application. Look at the ones that you think have the right cost UX for you. Then prototype your application, and I can't stress this enough. If the Facebook guys had prototyped it and tested it out in front of a small set of users rather than putting it on the App Store, they wouldn't have had the bad press that they did. So prototype your application. Take a few screens. Take a screen that you think will be hard to implement. Take one that you think will be easy to implement. And implement the key screens, the ones that you know will be used the most, and prototype them. See how they look. Give them to the users. And if they're happy with that, then you haven't made the wrong choice. Then obviously evaluate it. What's the code sharing like? Are you actually getting value for money from this framework? What's the developer experience like? Is it putting up barriers? And what's the user experience like? But let your users tell you that. Don't just decide for yourself. And that's it. So hopefully that's helped you with some tricky decisions if you're in that position. That's me. You can reach me on Twitter, and you can also have a look at Property Cross on the internet. So, any questions?
Well, can I jump in there? Because 5 minutes, you either 5 minutes to do the other talk, or 5 minutes to do questions.
Yeah.
Well, there's enough time to do both.
Oh yeah, it's only a 5 minute talk, and it's 20 to 8.
Yeah, okay.
Do it. Okay.
So first I'd like to thank you, because I got a lot out of that. It was really useful. So thanks for that. And my question is, if you needed to prioritise UX, what would you choose?
Difficult question. It depends. If you want to prioritise UX but stick to within the norms of the different frameworks, then technologies like SENCHA gives a good user experience, but it doesn't give you a lot of freedom. So you can't create fancy gesture-based user interfaces. So if you want something that looks good but isn't too fancy, then technologies like SENCHA are pretty good for that. Also, Titanium is pretty good for that as well. But if you want something entirely novel, then I think Xamarin is probably your only real viable option, or just write it 2 or 3 times. And sometimes you just have to do that.
Thank you.
Have you got any advice about writing it 2 or 3 times?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think one of the hard things there, I've been through this kind of process where the hard thing is you get it very much siloed with different teams, and it's a really hard job for the person sitting in the middle, communicating between the teams, making sure everyone's covering the same functionality and giving each platform the attention that it deserves. I mean, I can't really say much more than that. It's a really tough job. You're trying to do the same thing 3 times and do it just as good each time, but do them simultaneously. It's tough. You know, do a bit of C++. Share some code that way. Any other questions?
The argument against JavaScript is often to drop down for mobile things. You've got to be very careful with resources and such. JavaScript is a language that's impossible to actually manage in memory.
Sencha Java.
Sencha Java, yeah. Does this have an implication on things like battery life for the devices that you noticed or memory usage?
Not that I've heard of.
As well as languages?
No, not that I've heard of. I think one of the things that Sencha spent a lot of time doing is, for their fastbook application, is implementing a decent infinite scroll. Because the browser HTML DOM are all designed around rendering static content. That's what it was designed for 20, 30 years ago, and that hasn't changed. So doing fancy things like scrolling and recycling of cells isn't something it was designed to do. It isn't something that comes out of the box. So that's why sometimes it helps to rely on the really great engineers at companies like Sencha to solve some of those tricky problems for you. It can be done. Personally, I wouldn't be clever enough to do all that on my own. I know when to lean on other people to take their good stuff. So, do you have a question?
Have more relaxed objections to frameworks now? Is there a risk that they could reject your app in using one of these frameworks?
I've never heard of an objection purely from using a framework. There were a few years ago they didn't allow you. Apple, it's always Apple that reject things. Apple didn't allow you to run a virtual machine within your device. Xamarin doesn't use a C# common language runtime. They don't use a virtual machine, and I don't think Adobe Air does either. But again, this is why you've got to have a look at the community behind these frameworks. Again, it's something you have to check out, but I haven't heard of that problem existing at all. You certainly wouldn't get it with Sencha, JQuERYMOBILE, any of the guys I've talked about.
Whilst they may offer kind of a unified build opportunities, do you know any which excel at integrated testing, so kind of automated integration testing, I guess?
I haven't seen that whole thing put together. There's a thing called TestAbout, which I forgot the name of the company, but Xamarin acquired them recently, which is quite a neat idea that allows you to run your app on, say, 300 or 400 real physical Android devices, and it will run test cases and do screenshots and solve that problem for you to a certain extent, I guess. I've not seen someone integrate everything for cross-platform mobile and testing as well. I think that's too big an ask for anyone company to do.
At least HTML5 is, we've got Phantom.js and the like now, so we can kind of spin up browsers.
Yeah, I don't think Phantom.js is really going to help you test end-user experience and stuff that really matters. It will help you do your functional testing, for sure, but I think functional testing is probably a very small part of what you're doing on mobile applications. Typically, functional, they don't do that much. The real hard functionality typically goes back to the server. It's the end-user stuff that you need to test.